Chapter 1. The Self Acronym, CE as Key, and the Sacred Mood. Chapter 1. The Self Acronym, CE as Key, and the Sacred Mood. Introduction. Awakening to the Mood of Meaning. Before any philosophy begins, there is a mood, a tone, a vibe. Self-philosophy does not begin with a logic puzzle or a textbook definition. It begins with a feeling. That feeling is what we call cultural effervescence, CE. Pronounced key, CE is the energetic spark of a community or an individual in flow, an emotional spiritual vibration that connects memory, meaning, and movement. This chapter explores the foundational structure of self-philosophy by explaining the self-acronym, defining CE as the central sacred energy of lived experience, and introducing the concept of semiospheres as emotional spiritual reality zones. The self-acronym, a spiral of symbol and feeling. Self stands for semiotic, emotional, living, framework. It is a recursive acronym meant to echo itself. The self framework is not linear, it spirals. It represents the endless loop of how meaning is formed through symbols, charged with emotion, embedded in life, and reinforced by frameworks, systems, culture, ideology, story. Self-philosophy recognizes that the phenomenon of consciousness is not a static thing, but a looping, breathing dance of interpretation and emotional charge. Semiotic refers to the symbolic dimension of reality, the signs, codes, and images that give shape to thought. As Clifford Geertz argued in his anthropological work, culture is a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms, by which people communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge and attitudes toward life. Emotional grounds these signs in lived experience. Emotions are not just reactions. They are the meaning glue that binds symbol to life. Living reminds us that this is not abstract theory. It breathes. It evolves. It shifts with each generation, each person, each mood. As Edmund Husserl framed it in his notion of the life world, Lebenswelt. All meaning arises within a pre-reflective, lived field of experience where things are felt before they are named. Framework shows that what we call reality is scaffolded by cultural, narrative, and ideological structures. These are not fixed. They can be dismantled, remodeled, or healed. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke often of the necessity of reevaluating the structures of meaning imposed by society, of confronting the lies of morality, tradition, and identity to rediscover authentic experience. The self-loop is always spinning. A symbol triggers a feeling. The feeling confirms a reality. That reality becomes part of a cultural framework. The framework begins to dictate what symbols are used. The spiral continues. CE as Key. The emotional mood of sacred living. Cultural effervescence, CE, derived from Durkheim's sociology but redefined in self-philosophy, is the sacred emotional energy of community and meaning. CE is not just hype or excitement. It is the mood of life that makes symbols feel real. When a crowd chants together, CE is present. When a child learns their name, CE is present. When a protest movement surges, or a sacred rite binds a people, CE is the invisible force moving them. In self-philosophy, CE is spiritual. It is our version of Chi, K, or spiritus. But unlike many traditional metaphysical terms, CE is fully grounded in emotional semiotics. It is what happens when symbols and emotions lock into place and begin to generate shared reality. This is why we say CE is pronounced key. It is the key to unlocking why people believe what they do. why they feel what they feel, and how culture maintains control. Whoever controls CE controls mood. Whoever controls mood controls reality. The semiosphere, zones of lived lore. In biology, we speak of ecosystems. In physics, of fields. In self-philosophy, we speak of semiospheres, fields of symbolic emotional meaning. The semiosphere is the emotional spiritual reality zone in which people live. It is shaped by media, tradition, architecture, conversation, ritual, and art. Every time you walk into a cathedral, or hear the anthem of your country, or scroll through a social feed, you are entering a semiosphere. Each semiosphere has its own rules, its own logic, and its own emotional resonance. Semiospheres are not passive. They actively frame reality. They shape what counts as sacred, what is considered real, who gets to belong, which feelings are acceptable. Because of this, semiospheres can either nourish or oppress. They can be designed for healing, or they can be weaponized. The architecture of a temple or the layout of a school can carry embedded lore, emotional expectations, and encoded beliefs about the world. Geertz's insight that religion is a cultural system, comprised of symbols that establish powerful moods and motivations, directly supports the self-notion of semiospheres as emotionally governed fields. Likewise, Nietzsche's warning about the oppressive weight of inherited systems challenges us to examine our semiospheres for traces of cultural narcissism. LARPs and lore maintenance. LARP in this context does not mean live-action roleplay as cosplay. It means something deeper. In self-philosophy, LARP stands for lore, affect, role, performance. All humans are participating in cultural LARPs. These are inherited roles, affective moods, and symbolic performances reinforced by semiospheres. For example, a teacher enters a classroom and performs the LARP of authoritative wisdom. A citizen sings the national anthem and performs the LARP of patriotic loyalty. A priest dons robes and performs the LARP of sacred authority. These are not lies. They are emotional performances of belief. They are how lore is kept alive. In this view, the emotional weight of culture is carried through LARPing. It is through performance that belief is made visible and transmitted. When the LARP is no longer emotionally charged, when CE is lost, the system begins to collapse. Conclusion: the sacred mood of semiotic life. This chapter has laid the foundation for understanding the entire self-philosophy system. At its heart is a commitment to the reality of emotion as a meaning maker, and to the spiral dance of symbol, feeling, life, and framework. By understanding the SELF acronym, embracing CE as the key, and seeing semiospheres and LARPs as the structuring agents of human reality, we open a new door, a door into the emotional physics of consciousness, a way to understand not just what people believe, but how belief feels, how it's performed, and how it can be transformed. In the chapters to come, we will explore how this framework helps explain emotional imbalance, cultural power, ancient myth, media lore, and the future of spiritual life on Earth. Self is not a fixed model. It is a living philosophy, ready to be inhabited, questioned, and emotionally lived. Chapter 2: Semiospheres and LARPs. Chapter 2: Semiospheres and LARPs. Introduction: the mood that shapes the world. We don't live in a vacuum. We live in meaning fields. These are invisible ecosystems made of memory, language, mood, and structure. In self-philosophy, we call these meaning fields semiospheres. They are the places where symbols are born, belief is nourished, and emotional lore is passed down. A semiosphere is not a metaphor. It is the actual psychological and emotional climate that shapes how people behave. It's the culture you breathe, the psychic texture of your surroundings. It's in your school, your church, your bedroom, your phone screen. You're inside one now. To understand why people act the way they do, why culture moves the way it moves, we must understand semiospheres and how they carry emotional lore. This lore is performed through cultural roles we call LARPs: lore, affect, role, and performance. What is a semiosphere? A semiosphere is a symbolic emotional field, a zone where communication, mood, and memory form an experiential habitat. Every culture, subculture, family, and movement has its own semiosphere. Some are nurturing, some are oppressive. All of them teach us how to feel. Semiospheres operate like psychic weather systems. They contain core symbols, flags, crosses, logos, hashtags, uniforms, mascots, emotion scripts, what emotions are allowed, repressed, or rewarded, behavioral roles, who gets to speak, lead, cry, punish, resist, memory lore, what stories are told, repeated, or erased. A semiosphere doesn't just influence what you think, it tells you who you are. It does this without needing words. Just step into a cathedral, or a courtroom, or a football stadium. The mood changes. You change. That's semiospheric power. The sacred role of LARPs. To live in a semiosphere is to perform belief. This is where LARPs come in. In self-philosophy, LARP stands for lore, the stories and symbolic codes embedded in the culture. Affect, the mood or emotional charge carried by these stories. Role, the identity position a person takes within that symbolic structure. Performance, the public and private acts that reinforce the role. People don't just believe things, they perform those beliefs. They LARP their place in the culture. LARPing is not faking. It's how belief becomes visible. It's how culture gets emotionally transmitted. Consider a judge in robes, a teacher in front of a classroom, a child at a birthday party. All are participating in LARPs shaped by their semiosphere. These LARPs teach them who they are, how to feel, and what is normal. Semiospheres as emotional conditioning fields. Over time, semiospheres train people in specific emotional moods. These are reinforced through rituals, repetition, architecture, and media. Just as a greenhouse shapes how a plant grows, a semiosphere shapes how a human feels. For example, a militarized semiosphere may valorize obedience, suppression of grief, and celebration of sacrifice. A corporate semiosphere may reward competition, polite apathy, and toxic optimism. A religious semiosphere may encode guilt, awe, purity, and hierarchical submission. These emotional scripts are not random. They are engineered. Cultural narcissism arises when a dominant group constructs a semiosphere in their own image, erasing or subjugating all others. This becomes a mood monopoly. Cultural narcissism and mood control. When one cultural LARP becomes dominant and absolute, it creates what Self calls animus lore, a male-coded, control-focused symbolic order that bends all moods toward conquest, hierarchy, and ego worship. Animus lore thrives in semiospheres where emotional diversity is punished, symbolic control is centralized, sacred meaning is commodified, Myth is weaponized for obedience. This is where mood becomes control. The semiosphere becomes a prison with stained glass windows. People LARP not for joy, but for survival. Reclaiming the sacred mood. The goal of self-philosophy is not to destroy all semiospheres or LARPs, but to awaken them, to choose them consciously, to design spaces, communities, and stories that foster healing, honesty, and sacred mood diversity. To reclaim your semiosphere. Identify the symbolic codes you live in. Recognize the LARPs you perform. Trace the emotional scripts you've inherited. Ask, what kind of mood am I being asked to feel? From here, new semiospheres can be seeded. New lore can be written. Sacred mood can return, not as a tool of control, but as a wellspring of emotional spiritual truth. This is the beginning of cultural healing. It starts by asking, what does your world feel like? Who decided that? And are you ready to feel something more true? Chapter 3. Pareto Emotional Dynamics. Chapter 3. Pareto Emotional Dynamics. Introduction. The emotional curve of power. In nearly every society, 80% of the emotional weight is carried by 20% of the population. This isn't just economics, it's emotional geometry. In the self-philosophy framework, we use the Pareto principle as a lens to explain how emotional labor, symbolic energy, and sacred meaning are unequally distributed in culture. The result is a Pareto curve of emotional dynamics. The few shape the mood of the many, but over time, that imbalance leads to collapse, or transformation. The 80-20 rule, revisited. Vilfredo Pareto noticed that 80% of Italy's land was owned by 20% of its population. The rule has since been applied to business, time management, and wealth. But in self-philosophy, we apply it to emotions, lore, and spirit. 20% of symbols dominate 80% of cultural memory. 20% of people set the mood for the 80%. 20% of narratives control 80% of sacred feeling. This is how mood monopolies are born. A few figures, myths, and roles generate the emotional tone that becomes normal. The bending of the curve. Animus lore and cultural narcissism. Over time, this curve bends even further. The 20% becomes 10%, then 5%, then 0.7%. This steep curve is the beginning of cultural collapse or fascism. Self calls this extreme imbalance animus lore. The emergence of male-coded, power-centric, mood-controlling narratives. When animus lore takes over, lore becomes rigid, inflexible. Emotional diversity is treated as deviance. Sacred mood is commodified or controlled. Myth is used to enforce obedience. The bending curve becomes a weapon. Those at the top of the curve dictate what emotions are valid, sacred, or legal. Art, religion, education, and media are captured by this elite class and used to reinforce control. Emotional labor as sacred labor. In healthy cultures, emotional labor is shared. Elders hold grief, artists hold beauty, educators hold imagination. But when animus lore dominates, emotional labor is extracted. The population is asked to perform joy under duress, suppress grief for patriotism, sacrifice dreams for survival, worship symbols they cannot question. This is not sustainable. The emotional curve becomes unbearable. The Pareto crisis point. When the imbalance becomes too steep, a Pareto crisis occurs. This is when cultural lore feels fake or hollow. Sacred mood becomes inaccessible. Emotional exhaustion hits the population. rebellion or reformation begins. This crisis is a sacred moment. It's a rupture that allows for new lore to emerge, new emotional scripts to form, and the curve to flatten once again. Flattening the curve toward sacred balance. The goal of self is not to abolish hierarchy entirely, but to consciously balance emotional labor. That means redistributing sacred storytelling, celebrating emotional diversity, creating LARPs that nourish the whole, designing semiospheres that restore dignity. When emotional power is shared, culture heals. The Pareto curve becomes a spiral of shared mood, sacred lore, and mutual becoming. This is the real revolution, not just a political shift, but a sacred redistribution of meaning. Chapter 4. Animus Lore and Emotional Bending. Chapter 4. Animus Lore and Emotional Bending. Introduction. The lore that shapes desire. Culture isn't just made of symbols, it is shaped by the desires behind those symbols. When a dominant group bends the emotional structure of society to reflect its own priorities, a phenomenon occurs: animus lore. This chapter explores how cultural narratives become distorted by unchecked masculine-coded desires, control, conquest, hierarchy, and how this distortion reshapes our emotional worlds. Animus as mood governance. The Latin term animus connotes reason, spirit, and will, often contrasted with anima, the soul or inner life. In self-philosophy, animus lore refers to a type of cultural myth-making where mood is governed by the ambitions of dominant power. This lore is linear, goal-driven, conquest-oriented, focused on honor, victory, purity, and dominance, often excludes or marginalizes emotions like vulnerability, care, and community. When this lore takes control of education, religion, film, art, and national identity, it shapes emotional expectations into rigid boxes. The bending of emotional space. Imagine emotional culture as a shared field, a semiosphere. In a balanced semiosphere, emotions like grief, joy, rage, fear, awe, and reverence coexist and inform one another. But animus lore bends this emotional field toward select values: discipline, aggression, suppression of fear, glorification of sacrifice. This leads to devaluation of care and emotional nuance, suppression of emotional expression outside accepted norms, emotional burnout in men, invisibility for women and non-binary identities, cultural myths that punish nonconformity, e.g., rebels, witches, queers, artists. The bending of emotional space is a form of psychic colonization. Examples in myth and media. Across Western mythology and modern pop culture, animus lore persists. Greek epics valorize war, glory, and male honor. Odysseus, Achilles. Biblical patriarchs reward obedience and bloodline continuation. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Modern cinema. From war films to superhero franchises, suffering is made noble only if it leads to victory. Even films that pretend to critique animus lore often reinforce it through aesthetic seduction, emotional suppression, and masculinist redemption arcs. Emotional bending in the classroom, temple, and nation-state. Animus lore is not just abstract. It lives in our institutions. In schools, competition, grading, and merit are prioritized over creativity, cooperation, or emotional literacy. In religion, obedience, guilt, and judgment override joy, mystery, and communion. In national lore, Historical trauma is rewritten as patriotic necessity. Conquest becomes destiny. The net result: the populace is taught to emotionally bend toward pride, loyalty, and numbness, even when truth or grief is warranted. Animus and the Pareto curve. The bending process exacerbates Pareto dynamics. The top 0.7% of mood makers, governments, studios, publishers, clergy, shape the 99.3%. Emotional narratives become mass-produced, predictable, industrial. Sacred becomes spectacle. Meaning becomes meme. Animus lore isn't inherently evil, but when unexamined, it feeds cultural narcissism, emotional authoritarianism, and the erasure of the soul. Counter-lore. The return of the anima. The antidote to animus lore is not its annihilation, but its balancing. Self-philosophy invites the return of anima lore, myths of depth, care, inner listening, and sacred slowness. These include rituals of grief and joy held in community, emotional education embedded in everyday life, art that centers ambiguity, softness, and mystery, cultural memory built from the bottom up, not the top down. Where animus seeks dominance, anima seeks resonance. Where animus bends emotion, anima flows with it. Towards sacred rebalancing. This chapter serves as a warning and an invitation. The mood of a culture is its soul language. When that mood is bent by unchecked animus lore, the entire spiritual and symbolic ecosystem suffers. But healing is possible, through art, through awareness, and through a sacred return to the full emotional field. This is not regression. It is remembering. Chapter 5. Pareto Crisis Case. Studies through History. Chapter 5. Pareto Crisis Case Studies through History. Introduction. Cultural narcissism and the emotional breaking point. Civilizations rise and fall not just through war or famine, but through emotional imbalance. A culture that suppresses grief, ignores communal memory, and idolizes dominance becomes brittle. In the self-philosophy framework, this is known as a Pareto crisis, when the emotional semiosphere is so bent toward a dominant minority that collapse or rebellion becomes inevitable. In this chapter, we examine 5 historical moments where Pareto emotional dynamics, manipulated through lore and mood, sparked profound shifts or collapses. Each case reveals how cultural narcissism, fascist moods, and animus lore operate not in isolation, but as systemic forces encoded through religion, media, and nationhood. Case Study 1. Akhenaten and the Solar Lore Collapse. Time: 14th century BCE. Place: Egypt. Akhetaten. Pharaoh Akhenaten attempted to reset Egypt's emotional and religious fabric by outlawing the old gods and elevating the Aten, a singular sun deity, through art, ritual, and architectural propaganda. This was a semiotic coup. Public spaces, music, sculpture, and even family imagery were flooded with a new aesthetic aimed at forging obedience and devotion. But the mood didn't hold. The priests of Amun, displaced and enraged, conspired with military leaders. After Akhenaten's death, the city was abandoned. The attempt to monopolize spiritual mood failed. Emotional mechanism: enforced joy, scripted awe, and the denial of ancestral continuity. Outcome: collapse of the one god experiment, erasure of his memory, and return to Amun's priesthood. Case Study 2. The Exodus and the Formation of Israelite Lore. Time: approximately 13th to 12th century BCE. Place: Levant and Egypt. The Exodus narrative, as memorialized in Torah, encodes a memory of spiritual liberation, but also trauma. Enslaved workers, possibly descendants of the Aten cult or other marginalized peoples, are mythologized as chosen. The lore centers a masculine hero, Moses, whose miracles validate divine power and collective identity. Cultural narcissism begins here. The chosenness becomes exclusivity. The divine is patriarchal, wrathful, and emotionally exacting. Emotional mechanism: joy in judgment, fear-based obedience, triumph through destruction. Outcome: a rigid emotional lore that persists into Christianity and Islam. Case Study 3. Rehoboam and the Kingdom Split. Time: approximately 930 BCE. Place: Unified Kingdom of Israel. Rehoboam, heir to Solomon, rejects the Council of Elders and intensifies labor demands. The 10 northern tribes secede, forming the Kingdom of Israel, while Judah remains in the south. What was once united under lore and ritual fractures under emotional arrogance. Emotional mechanism: hubris in power, scorn for the collective, pride over compromise. Outcome: permanent fracture of the Hebrew nation into North and South. Case Study 4. The American Civil War. Time: 1861 to 1865. Place: United States. The mythology of Southern honor, states' rights, and manifest destiny merged into a lore that dehumanized enslaved people while spiritually sanctifying rebellion. Confederate symbols, hymns, and sermons romanticized hierarchy and divine favor. Emotional mechanism: heroic sacrifice, martyrdom complex, denial of atrocity. Outcome: physical and psychic trauma. Cultural divisions still unresolved. Case Study 5. Nazi Germany and the Cinematic Control of Mood. Time: 1933 to 1945. Place: Germany. The Third Reich weaponized semiotics at an unprecedented scale. Through Leni Riefenstahl's films, rallies, uniform design, and Hitler's oratory, national mood was crafted like an artwork. The Volk was sacred. Outsiders were disease. Emotional mechanism: aestheticized power, divine nationalism, mythic purity. Outcome: genocide, world war, and generational trauma. Conclusion: the ritualization of crisis. Each case shows that emotional lore, if monopolized, will eventually implode. Art, story, symbol, and sacred feeling must remain fluid, communal, and multidimensional. The moment these are used as weapons of hierarchy, the Pareto curve steepens into collapse. The self-philosophy calls for a new lore, one that honors grief and joy equally, that doesn't fear mystery or difference. Through history, we see the warning signs, but we also see pathways to emotional renewal. Let this chapter be a mirror and a compass. Chapter 6. Modern Pareto Mythologies in Media. Chapter 6. Modern Pareto Mythologies in Media. Introduction. Myth as emotional infrastructure. Modern myths are not ancient relics. They are active cultural engines. Today, films, novels, games, and franchises function as emotional ecosystems, mirroring the same Pareto dynamics that shape religion and empire. These mythologies are coded in symbols, repeated narratives, and carefully sculpted moods. Using the self framework, this chapter analyzes modern cultural lore to identify how emotional manipulation, hero worship, and symbolic monopolization play out in mainstream media. Case Study 1. Star Wars: The Messiah and the Empire. George Lucas's Star Wars is a spiritual opera. It fuses ancient hero myths, Joseph Campbell's monomyth, Buddhist and Taoist energy lore, the Force, and American Revolutionary allegory. However, over time, the balance has shifted. The Jedi, once monks of flow and peace, become an elite warrior class. The Empire is fascism rendered glamorous. Darth Vader, the antagonist, becomes a cult hero, a redemption narrative that emotionally whitewashes genocide. Pareto mechanism: centralization of force and morality in bloodlines, the glorification of exceptionalism, and eventual emotional fatigue. Mood strategy: awe, nostalgia, betrayal, and cyclical restoration. Case Study 2: Metropolis, Class Warfare in Visual Lore. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, 1927, is a prophetic visualization of Pareto imbalance. The elite live in pleasure towers while the workers toil underground. The climax fuses religious imagery and machine man symbolism into a messianic revolution. Pareto mechanism: visual separation of classes as mythic destiny, mechanical labor as soulless, and salvation as rare and centralized. Mood strategy: dread, hope, divine reckoning. Case Study 3: Blade Runner, What Makes a Being Sacred. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, 1982, questions identity and spirit. The replicants, biotech slaves, develop memories and emotions. The mood is noir, rainy, contemplative, yet the emotional sympathy is with the hunted. Pareto mechanism: the soul is monopolized. Emotional life is reserved for elites, and manufactured beings are disposable. Mood strategy: melancholy, empathy for the other, ethical grief. Case Study 4: The Matrix, Digital Lore and Prophecy. The Matrix trilogy turns cyberpunk into sacred text. Neo is the One, echoing Jesus, Buddha, and Moses. The world is a simulation controlled by a machine elite. The rebellion is spiritual, emotional, and revolutionary. Pareto mechanism: mythic singularity. Only the One can liberate the masses. Emotional awakening is reserved for a chosen few. Mood strategy: revelation, adrenaline, sacrifice. Case Study 5: Legend of the Realist God, From Fantasy to Fatalism. James Cameron's Avatar promised ecological awe and spiritual communion, but Legend of the Realist God deconstructs this entirely. The film presents a world in which godhood is rationalized and despiritualized. No prophecy, no divine right, only realism. The narrative portrays a messiah whose power lies in unromantic truth. The story denies emotional reward for loyalty or faith, forcing the viewer to confront existential grief. Pareto mechanism: the myth is stripped of hope, rejecting cultural effervescence for emotional sobriety. Mood strategy: dissonance, melancholy, reflection. Conclusion: emotional lore is a mirror. Modern media continues the work of ancient temples. It channels mass emotion, glorifies select heroes, and encodes values through story. The Pareto curve in media favors 0.7% of characters, worlds, and outcomes. True emotional equality in storytelling remains rare. The Self framework invites new creators to craft emotionally honest lore, stories that reflect the diversity of grief, resilience, failure, and joy, not just conquest and legacy. Let the next myth be one of many, not one of one. Chapter 7: Philosophical Foundations of Self, East and West. Chapter 7: Philosophical Foundations of Self, East and West. Introduction: Cross-cultural wisdom and the self framework. Self-philosophy is rooted not in one tradition, but in the dynamic tensions and harmonies between many. This chapter explores 18 key philosophers, 9 Eastern and 9 Western, whose ideas resonate directly with the pillars of self, semiotics, emotional resonance, cultural lore, and the awakening of consciousness. Eastern philosophers. 1. Laozi, China, Taoism. Key idea: the Tao flows effortlessly, like water. Self-link aligns with martial flow, cultural energy, Cie, and the unseen rhythms of consciousness. Quote, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. 2nd. Nagarjuna, India, Madhyamaka Buddhism. Key idea: emptiness as the interdependent nature of all things. Self-link mirrors the semiotic web. Meanings arise through relationships, not absolutes. Quote, all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. 3. Dogen, Japan, Zen Buddhism. Key idea: being time, presence and action. Self-link cultivates the emotional now, the lived moment as sacred semiosphere. Quote, to study the self is to forget the self. 4. Confucius, China, ethics and ritual. Key idea: rites shape character. Harmony begins with self-refinement. Self-link reflects the lore of behavior, rituals that encode emotional culture. Quote, the superior man understands what is right. 5. Zhuangzi, China, Taoist philosophy. Key idea: the limits of language and perception. Self-link deconstructs symbolic authority, plays with emotional lore as fluid. Quote, a frog in a well cannot conceive of the ocean. 6. Sri Aurobindo, India, integral philosophy. Key idea: spiritual evolution through integration. Self-link proposes a lived awakening of collective and personal consciousness. Quote, man is a transitional being. 7. Jiddu Krishnamurti, India, psychological freedom. Key idea: truth is a pathless land. Self-link calls for liberation from conditioned lore and emotional manipulation. Quote, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. 8. Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnam, engaged Buddhism. Key idea: mindfulness as communal healing. Self-link emotional resonance through compassionate attention and awareness. Quote, understanding is love's other name. 9. Daisetsu T. Suzuki, Japan, Zen translator. Key idea: translates Zen for the West. Self-link bridges semiospheres, transforms emotional lore across cultures. Quote, enlightenment is like everyday consciousness, but 2 inches above the ground. Western philosophers. 1. Friedrich Nietzsche, Germany. Key idea: revaluation of values, myth as will to power. Self-link calls for the creative force behind lore, shaping new emotional foundations. Quote, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. 2. Edmund Husserl, Austria-Hungary. Key idea: life world, Lebenswelt, as the horizon of experience. Self-link consciousness lives through mood worlds and intersubjective symbols. Quote, we are only conscious of things through our orientation toward them. 3. Clifford Geertz, USA. Key idea: culture is a system of inherited conceptions. Self-link semiotics and emotional meaning embedded in symbols and rituals. Quote, man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. 4. Antonio Gramsci, Italy. Key idea: cultural hegemony, the symbolic control of society. Self-link Pareto imbalance explained through mythic domination. Quote, The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. 5. Walter Benjamin, Germany. Key idea: aura and symbolic decay in mass culture. Self-link. Art loses emotional sacredness through replication, semiotic collapse. Quote, "That which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of the work of art." Sex. Suzanne Langer, USA. Key idea: feeling is symbolic, art as the language of emotion. Self-link. Semiotic emotional frameworks as foundations of consciousness. Quote, "Art is the objectification of feeling." 7. C.S. Peirce, USA. Key idea: triadic semiotics, sign, object, interpretant. Self-link. Self is a recursive symbolic emotional loop, meaning through interpretation. Quote, "We think only in signs." 8. Carl Jung, Switzerland. Key idea: archetypes and the collective unconscious. Self-link. Emotional lore as inherited symbolic fields. Semiospheres of the psyche. Quote, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." 9. Martin Buber, Austria. Key idea: I-thou relationships, sacred dialogue. Self-link. Consciousness arises in emotional encounter, not isolated cognition. Quote, "All real living is meeting." Conclusion: living lore through shared insight. These thinkers, from temple to tavern, from east to west, form the backbone of self. They show that meaning is not inherited, it is created. Emotional resonance is not noise, it is sacred structure. And consciousness is not a mirror, it is a ritual, a dance, a shared becoming. Self lives at the crossroads of these traditions. Chapter 8. Tao of the Self. Bruce Lee and the Martial Flow of Consciousness. Chapter 8. Tao of the Self. Bruce Lee and the Martial Flow of Consciousness. Introduction. Movement as meaning. To conclude this exploration of self-philosophy, we turn to a figure who embodied living lore in motion, Bruce Lee. He was not merely a martial artist or actor. He was a philosopher of the body, the symbol, and the spirit. In Lee's vision, action and meaning become one. His life is the embodiment of the self framework, semiotic, emotional, living, and flowing. Bruce Lee's symbolic code: be like water. One of Lee's most iconic expressions, "be like water," epitomizes the flexible semiosphere. Water does not resist, it adapts, reshapes, and flows through every obstacle. This metaphor speaks directly to the emotional responsiveness and symbolic fluidity that defines the self spiral. Quote, "Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water." In this flow, the self recognizes that identity is not fixed. Lore is not fixed. Meaning evolves through emotional motion and experiential presence. Jeet Kune Do, the formless form. Lee rejected rigid systems. He created Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, as a living, evolving philosophy of motion. It reflects a radical semiotic openness, form without form, a direct expression of emotion through motion. Semiotic insight. Symbolic mastery requires living beyond the symbol. Emotional insight. Mastery is not control. It is presence, reaction, relationship. This is the Tao of the self, no longer performing culture as an inheritance, but awakening to it as a living flow state. Breaking cultural narcissism. Lee's multicultural approach to martial arts and philosophy was a direct confrontation to the animus lore of racial and cultural supremacy. Infusing Chinese, Japanese, Western boxing, fencing, and philosophy, He broke symbolic monopolies and proved that power does not need purity. It needs fluidity. Quote, "Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own." This attitude counters the cultural narcissism at the root of modern Pareto myths. The self emerges not through dominance, but through adaptive balance and sincere expression. Martial flow and emotional resonance. Lee's films are not just action stories, they are emotional symphonies. The rhythm of his body, the sound of his cries, the symbolism of his confrontations, all encode deep cultural emotions. Enter the Dragon explores betrayal, identity, and spiritual confrontation. The Way of the Dragon flips the colonial lens, casting the Chinese hero as liberator in the West. Game of Death symbolizes the final spiritual ascent, each level of the tower a new inner challenge. Every gesture is lore, every motion is myth. The viewer is emotionally trained not only to witness, but to feel and internalize a symbolic journey. Lee's legacy, flow state consciousness. Bruce Lee's life was a parable of the self framework. His mind, body, and art form a single current, semiotic. He redefined martial symbols and hero mythos. Emotional. His charisma and intensity moved audiences worldwide. Living. He evolved with experience, never settling for cultural cages. Framework. He trained others to awaken, not just to fight, but to flow. Conclusion. From strike to spiral. Bruce Lee leaves us with a final lesson. Awakening is movement. Consciousness is not a throne. It is a trail, a strike, a breath, a form that evaporates into freedom. The self-philosophy, too, is not a fixed doctrine. It is a dance of ideas, emotions, and culture, forever spiraling toward deeper meaning. Final quote. The key to immortality is first living a life worth remembering. Chapter 9. Conclusion. Living lore and the spiral of the self. Chapter 9. Conclusion. Living lore and the spiral of the self. Returning to the beginning. At the start of this book, we set out to understand the phenomenon of consciousness, not as a sterile abstraction, but as something lived, symbolized, and emotionally carried. Now, with 9 chapters complete, we circle back to the fundamental insight. We are always becoming. Self-philosophy is not a closed theory, but a living, breathing spiral. The spiral revisited. Let us recall the spiral model. Semiotic. Life is saturated with signs. Emotions are the ink. Emotional. Meaning is bonded through resonance, joy, grief, awe. Living. Culture is not static. It is played, reenacted, and renewed. Framework. Through conscious awareness, we reshape how we live within lore. The self is not a fixed object. It is a dynamic relation to the semiosphere. We are interpreters, creators, carriers. What it means to live lore. To live lore is to recognize that every choice, every relationship, every act of media or language is part of an emotional symbolic ecosystem. You are never just watching. You are never just consuming. You are co-creating meaning with every breath. Living lore means understanding your moods as part of collective atmospheres, tracing power back to symbolic control, reclaiming meaning through sincere, adaptive culture. The path forward. Self-philosophy is not just a framework to understand others. It is a mirror to see ourselves. It is a way to ask better questions. Where did this symbol come from? Why does this story move me? How do I want to participate in the lore I carry forward? From fandom to resistance, from identity to inheritance, every domain of life is rich with meaning. The self is the tool to navigate that richness. A final spiral. The 3 moods of transformation. We close with a synthesis of the 3 sacred moods that underlie transformation. Reverence, honoring the memory and spirit of what came before. Clarity, seeing the mechanisms of power and emotional design. Flow, embracing your role as a living artist of meaning. The self is a starting point. This is not the end. This is only the beginning of your spiral. Where you take it, into art, activism, education, spirituality, design, or self-reflection, is now up to you. You are not here to consume lore. You are here to live it. Thank you for reading.